Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Herbert Hoover, and the focus is Quaker Orphan Goes to Stanford. The Quakers date to the 1650s, George Fox in Europe, setting aside an element of Christianity that was perhaps a little more humble, egalitarian. Herbert Hoover later described the Quakers as having a literal belief in the Bible, great tolerance, and a conviction that spiritual inspiration sprang from the inward light in each individual. In consequence of plain living and hard work, poverty has never been their lot. Well, some of the Quakers decided to come to North America for religious freedom, including Andrew Hoover. This was in 1738. The Quaker Hoovers originally settling in Pennsylvania. Then they moved south into South Carolina. But the Quakers were among some of the early abolitionists in North America. Those who held slaves let them go. The rest moved back north, eventually settling for the Hoover Quakers in Iowa, in a tiny little hamlet called West Branch. Just about 400 folks, almost entirely farmers. They actually became a stop on the Underground Railroad, helping slaves escape into Canada. And then it was just after the Civil War in 1870 when Jessie Hoover married Huldah Minthorn. They married in 1870. They had 3 children, the second of which was a boy. They named him Herbert Clark Hoover. In his youth, he was known by Bertie, sometimes with Bert, but he almost didn't get out of his youth. At the age of 2, Bert Hoover had a terrible case of croup. In fact, his parents couldn't revive him. They laid him on the table. They thought he was going to die when all of a sudden Dr. Henry Minthorn, the brother of Huldah, came in and actually revived Hoover, saved his life. He lived until 90 years old after this. Well, Hoover was raised in the Quaker tradition, very purpose-driven. Self-reliance was key, service to the community, some of the principles that Hoover would hold for his entire life. Also, commitment to education. Well, Hoover started school when he was just 5 years old. What was his favorite subject? He said, none. They were something to race through so I could get out of doors. And that's what Hoover liked the best of growing up in Iowa, was time in the outdoors near the neighboring creek where he would fish for sunfish, suckers, and catfish with a willow pole, a line of butcher's string, a cork salvaged from the rubbish heap, an angle worm, and a 1-cent hook. All fun in his youth. He also loved to play sports, play baseball, liked to collect rocks down by the railroad tracks. These were some of the early happenings of Herbert Hoover. But there were also early tragedies. A typhoid epidemic came through Iowa in the 1880s, and Jessie Hoover was one of the victims. He died at the age of 34. Hoover was only 6 years old at the time. He basically never remembered his father, beginning a series of changes that Hoover would have to go through throughout his entire youth. Now, Hoover's mother was the more religiously devout, and she actually did a lot of preaching, not just in West Branch, but in revivals throughout Iowa. Lots of uncles and aunts around to help raise the children while Huldah was out of town, but the inner light in Huldah Hoover would also go out early. She caught a cold on one of these revivals. It turned into pneumonia, and in February of 1883, she died. Hoover, 8.5 years old, he's now an orphan along with his older brother and younger sister. Those 3 were split up amongst the relatives. Again, lots of aunts and uncles around. Hoover ended up with Uncle Alan and Aunt Millie on their farm a couple of miles outside of West Branch. A lot of hard work for him in his growing up. It would be school during the day, but chores in the morning, chores again in the evenings, and this was his routine for a couple of years when another change came into play. Remember that Dr. Henry Minthorn, who had helped keep Hoover alive when he was 2 years old? Well, he had moved to Oregon, Newberg, Oregon, and became the superintendent at the Friends Pacific Academy, a Quaker school in Oregon, and he had just lost his son, his only son, and he reached out to the family in Iowa and said, look, why don't I raise Herbert Hoover? He'll become part of my family, fill a little bit of a hole in my family, and I will give him the best education that he can find. Now, Hoover did not want to go. He had had plenty of change already in his life. His home was West Branch, Iowa. That's where he wanted to live. But the family said, look, the educational opportunity was too great. So they packed him up a bunch of food, put him on a train for that 7-day trip to the West, and he ended up now living with his uncle John, as he called him. Dr. Henry Minthorn went by the name of Uncle John, and they didn't always get along. He was stern, a bit of a taskmaster, focused on the chores, focused on school, sort of dominating his experience. One person who helped Hoover out a lot, though, was a woman named Jennie Gray, became a bit of a mentor to Hoover. Now, he was not encouraged to read much when he was in West Branch. That changed, both his uncle and Jennie Gray encouraging him to read all sorts of things. And she introduced him to things like David Copperfield and Ivanhoe, trying to get him to come out of his shell, because Herbert Hoover was shy, painfully shy, especially when he met new people. And it was also something that a characteristic he would have for the rest of his life. Well, in 1888, he's now 14 years old. Time for more change. Uncle John decided to get away from the school, sell his farm, and move the family to the territorial capital of Oregon of Salem. He and a couple of Quaker friends started the Oregon Land Company. There were a lot of settlers coming to the west, and he wanted to get in on this. So he and his friends bought up 3,000 prime acres and started marketing that to people in the East Coast. Well, Herbert Hoover wanted to be part of this, and so he actually quit high school, and he went to work full-time for his uncle in the land company at $15 a month. Jack of all trades. He did pretty much everything. He did bookkeeping, he did typing, he placed those ads in the magazines and the newspapers in the East. He would be out there first thing in the morning to greet the train and be the first one to welcome some of these potential settlers into the community. He would eventually help lay out streets and build homes, pretty much do a little bit of everything as part of this business. But then somebody else walked into Hoover's life that really changed his trajectory. Now, this was a mining engineer by the name of Robert Brown. Robert Brown was a friend of Hoover's father, never met him before, came to visit the Quakers in Oregon, and he told Hoover about this great life of being a mining engineer. You get to use your favorite subject of math. You get to be out in the outdoors all the time. Hoover thought this was great. There were tremendous opportunities in the West for mining. He wanted to go to college and study to be a mining engineer. The problem was that his uncle also wanted him to go to college, but only to a Quaker school. And as Hoover did his research, there wasn't a single Quaker school in the entire country that offered a degree in mining or geology. And that's what he wanted. That's what he was looking for. And he and his uncle were at a bit of an impasse. Well, then Hoover learned about a new school being built in California. Senator Leland Stanford of California had just lost his teenage son, and he decided to honor him by building what he wanted to be the best university on the West Coast in honor of his son. On his farm in the area of Palo Alto, California, they started construction ready to open up in 1891. Well, this was about a year before that, and Hoover said, "This is where I want to go. They have a geology and mining department. It's tuition free. This sounds great." Uncle John still saying, no, you need to go to a Quaker school. Well, things changed when a man came, one of the future professors at Stanford, by the name of David Swaim, came north into Oregon to give the entrance exams. They were trying to recruit new students for the first class at Stanford. And Hoover told his uncle about these entrance exams. And again, he wasn't interested initially until he mentioned the name David Swaim. Well, David Swaim was a familiar name to Uncle John because he was a Quaker. And that all of a sudden things were fine and Hoover could go take the entrance exam. The problem was he failed. Remember, he had dropped out of high school. He had actually gone back to night school to try to get ready for college, but there was just simply too much material that he didn't know. He failed his exams, but Swaim liked Hoover and said, look, why don't you come to California, take some tutoring all summer, study up, take the exams again in the fall, and if you can pass before we open up in October, you can join the first class at Stanford. And he said, okay. Well, the Minthorns and the family all came out to wish Hoover the best of luck, including his grandmother. Grandmother Minthorn said to him, I think thy mother would like to see thee now. A nice offering as he was about to leave on his own for the first time. Now, he had a few dollars in his pocket, but not much. Fortunately, it was tuition free. He was on the poorer side of things, but he did stay at one of the local boarding houses because the school wasn't finished yet. It was still being built on the farms owned by Senator Stanford. That first class getting ready to open up in the fall of 1891, Hoover spent the summer studying. He took those entrance exams. He passed them all except one, English composition. He failed. David Starr Jordan, the president of the university, said, you know what, we'll admit you, but you got to pass English comp before you can graduate. So at the age of 17, Hoover moved into the dorms on the Stanford campus. In fact, he claimed later he was Stanford's first student because he was there already. He moved into the dorms early. He was the first one there. He claimed he was the first student in the history of Stanford University. He was also among the poorest. and he was among the shyest. One of his classmates said he was shy to the point of timidity. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. It wasn't until later when I began to see under his surface that I realized how much it was possible to like him. Again, this shyness with new people, a trait that he would characterize with him for the rest of his life. Now, the major influence for Hoover at Stanford was Dr. John Branner, and he wasn't there in that first semester, but he arrived in the second semester as the chair of the Geology department. A tremendous mentor and friend to Herbert Hoover, and he really took to Hoover. He said once, I can tell Hoover to do a thing and never think of it again. If I told him to start to Kamchatka tomorrow and bring me back a walrus tooth, I'd never hear of it again until he came back with the tooth. And then I'd asked him how he had done it. They were mutually respectful. They both appreciated the skills that they had to offer. And in fact, Branner helped out Hoover, getting him summer jobs, such as after that first year at Stanford to help survey and map the rock formations in the Arkansas Ozarks. Tremendous hands-on experience. Also came back to campus with $200 in his pocket from his experience. Now, Hoover was very active in the social life and even the political life at Stanford. He was a part of the Barbs, short for barbarians. They were the poor element of the student body at Stanford, and he actually helped one of his fellow Barbs win a seat as the student body president. He wrote out a new student constitution, including a position of treasurer, which he eventually was given to try to help manage events better on campus. He agreed to serve at no pay because he was the one who put this in the Constitution in the first place. He had plenty of odd jobs around, just doing about anything he could to get money in his pocket, but this he was going to do for the students, and he did a great job, published the accounts of all the projects going on at Stanford in the student newspaper on a regular basis. He was involved in all kinds of activities. He managed the baseball team, he managed the football team, helped arrange the first football game ever between Stanford and its Cross Bay rival, the University of California from Berkeley. They played the game in San Francisco. Sold out crowd. Hoover's the manager orchestrating this whole event. Only problem was he forgot one thing: a football. Nobody brought a ball to the game, including him as the manager, so he sent a student out to a local sporting goods store, buy a couple of balls, brought it back. They had to delay the game by about a half hour, but nobody on the Stanford side cared. Stanford won that first edition of the big game, 14-0, and they earned about $30,000 in profits, paid for the football, really all for the full next season. Well, the other thing, again, Branner did for Hoover was get him those summer jobs, and for the next 3 summers, he worked for Dr. Waldemar Lindgren from the U.S. Geological Service, mapping the Sierra Nevada mountains. Again, tremendous hands-on experience for Hoover, who was stellar in the classroom in his major, not so much in some of his other classes. And remember, he still had to pass English Comp, which he never did. He took that exam after each year, he failed it each year, and his geology professors couldn't really understand this. A professor, J.P. Smith, said, look, Hoover writes well, and he had these scientific documents to show it, but what Hoover couldn't do was write under time pressure, and that's what these exams were going under. But Smith said this is ridiculous. Hoover is our best student. He went over to Dr. Melville Anderson, who was the chair of the English department, and said, well, read some of Hoover's work. He clearly can write. And Anderson said, fine, he can graduate, even though he never passed English composition. One of the highlights for Hoover took place in his senior year. The newest member of the geology department was a freshman, a female by the name of Lou Henry. Now, she was a bit of a tomboy, smart, athletic, adventurous, and she wanted to be a mining engineer. The only one in that major, the only female in that major at Stanford, and one of only 4 in the entire country. This was not a career typically for women, but Lou Henry, this is what she was most passionate about. And she was introduced to Hoover by Dr. Branner. And Hoover said, as I was Dr. Branner's handy boy, I felt it my duty to aid the young lady in her studies, both in the laboratory and in the field. Now, there were other suitors for Lou Henry, but she only really had eyes for Herbert Hoover. They became inseparable, committed to each other, not ready to marry. She wanted to get her degree. Hoover needed to go out and make some money, and so he was ready to graduate. He did so in May of 1985. He's a 20-year-old ready to make a name for himself. But that is the story for another day. And that is Herbert Hoover and Quaker Orphan Goes to Stanford, from the life of Herbert Hoover. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.